everybody. Welcome to Church History for Chumps, episode 4. Honestly, I'm going to keep this intro real brief because this might be the best episode we've recorded. At least it's my personal favorite. When Thomas and I first started talking about doing a podcast, we threw this guy's name around immediately as a guest we'd want to have. His name is Josh Palmer. He's a pastor in our city, and he's also just sharp as a freaking tack, dude. So we're talking about the fall of Jerusalem, not the one in 586, but the one in 70 AD. We talk about not just the fall itself, but what kind of ripple effects this was going to have on not just early Christianity, but even early Judaism. It is a fascinating conversation. Pastor Palmer really knows his stuff, really makes us just kind of like feel like a little bit more of a real podcast. So for that, Josh, thanks again. And for everyone else, I hope you really enjoy this one. This is Church History for Chumps. We're glad you're here. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another show, another episode of Church History for Chumps. My name is John Simon. I'm greeted by my partner in crime, Mr. Thomas Duell.
Hey.
And today we have I can't say a very special guest because he's kind of our only guest we've ever had. So he's a guest, and he's here, and he's a good friend of me and Thomas's. He's a local pastor in our city, pastor of a Lutheran church, Pastor Josh Palmer. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Tommy, we've been excited about this for a while, haven't we?
Yeah, man.
We've really been
one of our first automatic, oh, of course we're gonna have Josh on to talk about stuff.
Right. The first fear was like, well, what if he makes us not look so smart? But I think that after doing a couple episodes, we realized coming across smart was never gonna be an accomplishment of this.
Yeah.
So, but yeah,
kind of our lifeline right now, actually.
Yeah, we're hoping that you bring all of our followers back. This might be the episode where they're like, all right, I'll do one with a guest because these two by themselves, it's just not scratching that itch for me. And hey, we appreciate giving us another try. Josh is going to be here to save our podcast.
I should take a picture for our inevitable promo of this episode.
Did I tell you about an idea that I had about how we would kind of engage social media once we get everything rolling?
Where we just roast everybody all the time?
Well, but I was also thinking we could find like medieval paintings that have some type of connection to the topic we're discussing, and then we just Photoshop our faces into like the crowd. Or, I was talking to our buddy Ryan about it, and he was like, if you guys ever did an episode on the historical Jesus, you could do your faces on the thieves that are being crucified by Jesus, which I told him was kind of a bummer because one of those thieves got his eyes pecked out by a crow.
Yeah, that's the bummer.
Yeah.
You're right.
Right, yeah, that's the really disappointing part. And that just doesn't say much about the future of our friendship, I guess. We're both thieves, but only one is really going to be taken care of. So
if we do that, we got to use an Orthodox cross so that there's a real clear footstool, slant.
You think the Orthodox cross was more comfortable?
Because that a footstool?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. It's like having an ottoman.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. There's something I want to say right now, but we'll just probably continue with the episode.
All right. Okay. Well, so what we basically did was we reached out to Josh and we said, hey, we know that you're a very smart person, so just throw a couple topics out for us and we'll do our best to, sound mildly informed. But we're really going to let you run away with it, and then we'll just be here for color commentary. We're just in full on riffing mode right now.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Well, and to give our listeners an idea of like what talking to Josh in normal conversation is like, is he's the only person I know who you'll just be talking about some sort of topic, and then he'll be like, oh yeah, in the South African Quarterly political theory magazine from the 1960s, there was an article that, and it's just like, you can draw, and I've been in your house, or at least it was an old house of yours. I don't know what the design is where you put all your books, but Josh is the only person I've known who ever has had floor to ceiling books on both sides of his living room.
What you're saying is I need to invite you over.
I need to see the new setup. Yeah, I'd like to see that.
Come over.
So
yeah, that is not an exaggeration. I still remember a time in great detail with a pastor of a conversation of many pastors, and Josh said, "You know, there was an article in the New York Times in 1987, and the author was an Iranian American, and they were writing this fascinating piece about." And then I just stopped. Like my brain was just like, "I can't. This is not a conversation for me."
You're sweet. You're gonna end up disappointing all your listeners.
Well, we'll see. So our topic today is the fall of Jerusalem, which was very fun to look up because when I tried to look into some resources for it, I realized Jerusalem has kind of fallen a number of times.
Yeah,
because there were the Crusades falls, and there was the Babylonian siege in 586, and Jerusalem is known for falling.
Yeah.
But this was the big boy.
Well, and
they were the French before the French, right? Always losing.
That's right.
Yeah, right. I was debating because it really matters how far you start back on this one.
Sure.
So like 587 is actually a pretty good place to start because that's the first time it falls after David takes it, right?
Uh-huh.
So David takes it like sometime around 1050, something like that. And the Israelites have it until 587. And then Nebuchadnezzar comes and he levels it and he destroys the first temple. Mm-hmm. And my interest in the fall of Jerusalem started with like preaching. And because you get to the end of the church year, which is literally this Sunday, which is kind of fun that this is like dovetailing like that. Yeah. And Jesus is constantly talking about the end of the world in like this telescoping fashion with the fall of Jerusalem. And so like I had to look it up, and looking up, what I thought you were going to say when you said you looked it up and the resources is that there's just too much stuff.
Oh yeah.
It's crazy how much stuff there is. And like the significance for like Christianity and like Christian history of the fall of Jerusalem is actually relatively simple. It's the moment at which we stop being considered, or at least it's a reasonable guess for the moment at which we stop being considered part of Judaism anymore. Yeah. And, but like the actual story of it is one of those things that is like a tragedy in human history, like on a monumental scale. But like it's kind of cool because 587, the southern kingdom gets wiped out, right? And the Jews go into exile. And what ends up happening over the next like 300-400 years is the development of something that we all know really, really well, which is the development of the synagogue. Right. And the synagogue is primarily known for its gathering around the Word of God once a week. And it becomes the place that the group that is most well known to Christians in the Gospels as being like Jesus's foil. That's where they get their power base, if you want to use power language. Yeah. The Pharisees are the ones who are teaching in the synagogues, and most commonly are the rabbis. And so like you have this development over like a 300-year period as Jerusalem gets rebuilt and the second temple gets built and all the stuff you get in like Ezra and Nehemiah. You have the development of a parallel system that is not related to the temple at all. Right. That is Judaism outside the temple.
Because you would almost argue that the synagogue system was a reaction to temple-less Judaism, because so much of their religion was rooted around the existence of a temple, right?
Well, and the forced exile of the Jews into the greater world creates a diaspora that is like super, like you have to come up with some way to still be a Jew, but live in Persia or Rome or whatever. And the solution is the synagogues. Yeah. And then like it was still expected that like if you were a good Jew, you went to Jerusalem maybe as many as like 3 times a year to go to the temple. But like your day-to-day, week-to-week worship was synagogue worship. And the significant part about it is that, just to hit this again, that the Pharisees, ran it. And they ran it based on teaching the people the word of God. This was their whole thing. And like, so like if you're going to go for the fall of Jerusalem, Josephus is your main guy.
Yeah.
And
He's like eyewitness, right?
He's an eyewitness of the fall. And he gives us most of our background in like a, let me explain it to you idiots who don't understand sort of way, structure of Jewish society leading up to 70 AD. And he says that what's developed is 4 distinct parties in Judaism. You have the ones that you're familiar with from the Bible, right? The Pharisees, who Jesus is constantly after, and I think the Pharisees. It's hard to remember that, at least for me, that the Pharisees are good guys. And so when the Gospels are talking about the Pharisees this way, that it's turning something that's accepted wisdom upside down. Because the one thing that the Pharisees learned from the fall of Jerusalem in 587 to the Babylonians is don't disobey God.
Right.
And so like all the Pharisaical laws, all the fences around the law in order to keep you from accidentally breaking the Sabbath or accidentally breaking the law, those are all like honest and earnest attempts to keep God from like destroying Jerusalem again.
Yeah.
And so when Jesus shows up, calling the Pharisees bad guys, like the Pharisee and the publican, that parable, that's like mind blowing, because if your daughter comes home and she says, "Daddy, Daddy, I'm marrying a Pharisee," you're like, "Yeah,
this is great
all right,
news.
This is great. This is who you want in your family." And the second party are the Sadducees, which we also know. But what Josephus says is the Sadducees basically run the temple. And there was a debate in Jewish society of how the Jews should be relating to the Romans. So the Romans take Jerusalem, annex Jerusalem in like 63 BC. And from then on, there's a debate about how to handle the Romans. The Pharisees are almost like, you called me a two-kingdom person earlier before we came on air.
Like lovingly.
Gently, like sweetly. The Pharisees are two-kingdom people. As far as I understand, they basically don't think that we should pay attention to the Romans.
Right.
We do our religious thing, and they do their political thing, and just hopefully nobody crosses anybody's path.
Are you willing to go on record calling the Pharisees your theological grandparents?
Nobody from the LCMS will listen to this. Yeah.
All right, well, that's kind of a shot at our podcast there, but we're sending this straight to Missouri, bro.
This is going to the Purple Palace. Yeah,
that's right.
The Sadducees had a different approach. The Sadducees' approach was accommodationism.
Yeah.
And they were like the intellectual elites. They owned the high priesthood because, of course, when the Romans find out there's a section of society that is like, yeah, we want to work with you, they're going to put them in the high priesthood over and over and over again. And so they usually own the Sanhedrin. They usually, they always have the high priesthood. And the Pharisees kind of despise them for being like involved in bed with the Romans.
Yeah.
Then there's a third group that is the Essenes. The Essenes leave. They're like, we're out. They're the Benedict option guys.
Yeah.
And they go to the Dead
Which
Sea.
is probably actually truly your theological grandparents.
Probably.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Right.
All right.
And we think that's where John the Baptist comes from, right? Is an Essene community, probably. They're famous for adopting orphans, and there's a theory that John the Baptist's parents died relatively early and he got adopted.
Now, the Essenes did not vibe with the temple, right?
No, in fact, the Essenes...
Did they vibe with anybody?
No. That's why they had to remove themselves. They thought that the high priesthood had become corrupt because of their interaction with the Romans and some other things, like the Maccabees and stuff. But they didn't approve of anything, and they left.
Interesting.
And it's the fourth group that's most important for the conversation about the fall of Jerusalem, which is the Zealots.
Because they're one of the ones that kind of pissed off the bear.
Absolutely poked the bear. And one of Jesus' disciples was a Zealot, right?
Right.
Simon the Zealot. The Zealots felt that any involvement with the Romans, anything short of trying to reestablish the Davidic kingdom in a military way, was not being true to God. And so the Zealots start with a rebellion that gets put down pretty quickly. The leader of the rebellion never reappears. We don't know what happens to him. But it was one of those situations, a little bit like Star Wars-y, where you kill the leader and it just makes the thing worse.
Right.
And so in 66 AD, kind of some tensions that had been boiling under the surface for a long time, and even like popping out in the Jewish and Roman relations comes to a head. So Caesarea is on the coast, a little bit west and north of Jerusalem. And the Roman governors had decided that was their capital instead of Jerusalem. It's just easier. And in Caesarea, some Greeks sacrificed some doves on the doorstep of a synagogue. And that kind of thing happens in the ancient world. Nobody liked the Jews because they were considered atheists because they only had one God.
Yep.
And they were antisocial. They never participated in all the Roman rites and all this stuff. So like that kind of thing happened. Anti-Semitism was a real thing, and they were constantly complaining to Rome. What caused this one to be different is that when the Jews complained to the governor who was in Caesarea, the governor told them to go fly a kite. And this led to a riot in Caesarea where they killed some Gentiles. And then the Romans don't like it when you riot, so they killed some Jews.
Yeah.
And then the big boys got involved. So Julius Caesar was a particular friend of the Jews. And one of the things that he had given the Jews the authority to do is not to worship any of the Roman gods. They could stay worshiping their God only. And as the emperorship developed, they didn't have to pray to the emperor, as long as in exchange they always prayed for the emperor. So what happens is after this riot breaks out, the Jerusalem temple authorities stop praying for the Roman emperor. This is kind of like an act of war.
Yeah.
Right? This is the one thing that you have to do in order for us to stay out of your business. And they just absolutely throw it in the Romans' face.
That's a genius move by Caesar, too, by the way.
No, it is great.
Like, you're basically saying you guys can preserve your own heritage as long as in the heart of your religion, you are not going to act against the well-being of the empire. Like, that's ingenious. Yeah.
It's particularly good because Jerusalem is like the worst place in the whole world. I read a book a couple
there's our
yeah, there you go. from a empire perspective, let's say. I read a book and I can't remember the name of the author. It was just a biography of Jerusalem, the city, as if it was a person. And the first chapter was like, nobody knows why Jerusalem is as important as it is. It's not on any major thoroughfares. It's not on any major waterways. In fact, it's really hard to get to. And there are no natural resources. And in fact, there's a spring of water there that makes it really hard to besiege. So nobody has any idea why everybody wants Jerusalem.
It's hilly and mountainy too, right?
Yeah, and then the people who own Jerusalem, the Jews, end up being intractable and rebellious, and it's a real pain in the butt for everybody. Yeah. And so like I kind of assume that some of it is Caesar being like, let's just not have this fight right now.
Yeah. Kind of give the kids the crayons, let them draw on the table while the adults talk.
And so like when the Jews stop praying, when the high priest stopped praying for Caesar, this is cause for the governor to, and then there's some riots that happen in the city. And the zealots saw this as an opportunity, basically, to start making a difference. Yeah. And there was a group who eventually joined forces with the zealots. I don't know if they were at this point in the story yet, called the Sicarii. Okay. And the Sicarii just means knife men. And their whole gig, their whole gig was to go into crowds, especially like during temple worship or parades or whatever, and just like knife people and then like put the knife back under their coat. And so I think it's where the phrase cloak and dagger comes from. Yeah. Actually. Yeah. And they just killed both Jews and Romans. And the Romans, it really, really makes them mad when I'm going to accidentally swear on can we erase?
We can bleep it if we need to. Yeah, we got editors.
I'm going to try my hardest not to.
Yeah,
really, I am.
I said piss earlier, so maybe the cat's out of the bag. Yeah, and then I heard you correct me. I was like, shoot, I'm getting censored on my own podcast.
So the Sicarii kills some Romans, and the Roman governor, whose name is Florus, decides this is a great opportunity to raid the treasury. Taxes are always a problem. You always want to have money for whatever you need to do. So he raids the temple treasury in order to theoretically collect on unpaid taxes that the Jews have not paid.
Yeah.
And the Jews react in exactly the way you think they will. They kill the whole Roman garrison in Jerusalem.
Oh my God.
So this is a really bad idea,
Man, they
right?
would not like the IRS.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're right. They hire 85,000 new IRS agents. Well, and like, okay. So anytime you have one of these situations, the question is always, can somebody de-escalate? And there is nobody present to de-escalate. Florus captures the leaders, crucifies them. Escalation, right?
Yeah.
And like all hell breaks loose. The Jews retake Jerusalem. There is an invitation. The Zealots come down from Galilee. They fill the city. There's an invitation by the Zealots for the Idumeans, which I think live down in the southeast, to come in because, hey, we're going to have a fight with the Romans. Don't you want to get in on this?
This is what the Zealots have been waiting for, right?
Absolutely.
Like, they are psyched.
This is their moment.
Yeah.
So like 20,000 Idumeans come into Jerusalem in order to defend the city. The Sadducees don't like that because obviously this upsets the balance of power. So they invite 15,000 militiamen into the city, and all of a sudden the city is like a powder keg. And then Nero sends, in 67, Vespasian, who is a general, I believe he's in Egypt at this point, and he's like, can you go handle the situation, right? And Vespasian goes to Galilee because he gets there by boat, and he lands his army in Galilee, and he crushes the Zealots in Galilee, and that's when he takes Josephus prisoner of war. Josephus is a Jewish general, and that's when he joins Vespasian's army, and he begins to take notes on the war. And so, like, from this point on, Josephus is just invaluable. The Syrian governor invades to try and fix the situation. The Jews lay an ambush and kill 6,000 Romans. The Zealots feel like there are still too many traitors among the Jews in Jerusalem, so they kill like 8,500 worshipers in the temple, while they're in the temple. And so like the whole thing is just an absolute powder keg. 68, 69, there's a ton of infighting among the various groups. Yeah. And in addition, there is deep instability in the Roman Empire. So 68, 69 is what's known as the year of the four emperors, which is exactly what it sounds like, right?
A lot of assassinations and instability.
And so like there's not a lot of movement in the Roman, not a lot of impulse by the Romans to retake the city. And so you just basically have these two groups like entrenching, and then the Zealots kill the high priest. And they assassinate a guy named Annas, who is, I believe, the son of Annas, who's involved in the Gospels. Okay. And when the Zealots do this, because he's more sympathetic to the Romans, they bring in a guy who, as far as I can understand, his name was Phani, Phani. And as far as I understand it, he had like literally never been to the temple. And so they install him as high priest as kind of a joke. And he doesn't know how to do any of the sacrifices. He doesn't know how to do any of the rituals. And this is the moment that Josephus says is the fulfillment of Daniel's abomination of desecration.
Okay.
Josephus thinks this is the moment at which God forsakes the temple, because the whole thing is a joke.
And when you say Josephus, do you mean Josh Palmer?
Well, I don't know what you mean.
No. We're gonna get into all of that.
All right.
I'm just waiting, like,
that's all I want to do here is like,
there is.
What's the theological implications for us?
We
can get there later.
The connection of the destruction of the temple seems inseparable from a lot of apocryphal texts, and I want to get into that later, but let's keep the story rolling.
You're doing a good job.
Thank you.
Ignore me.
Thank you,
also, dude, it feels like the Zealots were the worst people to have around, because like they're the muscle and they're the ones who were angry enough to like mobilize. But like when you said there was infighting, I was like, of course there's infighting, because they never believed that the mainstream sects of Judaism were extreme enough.
Nope.
So there's no way they can peacefully cohabitate with them while they're just waiting for Rome to show up and for the day of glory to arrive.
Absolutely
like they're gonna be just hostile and super like it's just flammable. Yeah,
it's just a true thing to say that fanatics don't get along with people.
Yeah.
I mean, whether you're talking about Manchester United or whoever you're talking about, fanatics just don't get along with people.
They're not great at that. I see it.
And that's exactly what happens. By 70, the siege starts. Mm-hmm. Vespasian has gone and become the emperor at that point, and his son Titus is running the army. Mm-hmm. He's got 4 or 5 legions. Titus has this brilliant idea. It's coming up on Passover. And so Titus has this brilliant idea, I believe it's Passover, that if the pilgrims come to Jerusalem for Passover, he'll let them in.
Yeah.
But he's besieging the city. He's not going to let them out.
Mm-hmm.
So the city like swells by like 5 times its size, but he's not letting anybody out, and it's a siege. So like people are starting to starve to death, and the zealots think that the zealot leadership think that nobody's trying hard enough against the Romans, so they burn the food supply.
Ooh. Hey, okay.
You know what's a great idea in a siege? No food.
Right, yeah.
And it's terrible. It's just everything from then on, you're talking just atrocity after atrocity. Mm-hmm. And it's all the things that happen in sieges. It's eating things that are not edible, cannibalism, disease running wild. The Romans have a real pleasant policy of any time they catch somebody, crucifying them in sight of the city, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so the thing goes for 7 months, and on July 30th, 70 AD, which is the 9th of Av, according to the Jewish calendar, Jerusalem falls. Mm-hmm. And this is super significant to the Jews. They still celebrate it to this day.
Yeah.
Celebrate's a weird word to say there.
I was going to say, is that really the word?
It's called It's called the Tisha B'Av. Mm-hmm. And there are 5 bad things that happened on Tisha B'Av. The 10 spies rebelled in the Old Testament. The Jerusalem fell in 587 on the same day, the 9th of Av. Jerusalem fell in 70 AD on the 9th of Av. The Bar Kokhba revolt. 580,000 people were killed in 135 AD on the 9th of Av.
Yeah.
And then in 135 AD, they plowed Jerusalem on the 9th of Av.
Seems like a good day to just plan a vacation.
Just stay in bed.
You know? Yeah.
Don't get up.
Let's hit Rome for a little bit. Yeah. See what's going on in Athens.
Yeah. No, that's
just
exactly
gonna
right.
make a reminder, like to check on Facebook on July 30th, and any of the people on my friends list who have birthdays. I'm gonna cut them out of my life.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
No, it'll change from year to year because it's a lunar calendar. So you just have to look up the 9th of Av.
That's a
and every year you can just cut different people out of your life.
That sounds awesome, actually.
Imagine if every one day of the year you could just purge an unknown number of people from your Facebook. It's like, well, sorry, Dad, but you know.
Hey, Mom, you know what today is?
Happy birthday.
It's the 9th of Av, Mom.
That's right.
That's exactly right. So just to kind of wrap it up, the Romans burn the city.
Yeah.
There's a debate about what Titus wanted done with the temple. We think that he did not want it destroyed because that would cause even more problems. But what Josephus says is that something gets out of hand and the temple starts to burn. And there's a debate about then the next step, which is either the gold in the temple melted and went into the cracks, and the Roman soldiers literally pried it stone from stone to get to the gold, or there was a rumor that there was gold hidden in the walls. Mm-hmm. And so either way, what the result was, the Roman army just literally took it apart stone from stone, so that all that's left after that is like the Wailing Wall. That's it. Everything else is like literally ripped apart because, and honestly, just speaking theologically, this is what Jesus said would happen, right? Stone from stone. And in the end, there are like 1.1 million killed. There are 97,000 Jews enslaved. And the result, following the parties question, like which of the Jewish parties there are, is that the Romans kill the Sadducees. and make sure that there are no priests left, so that you cannot rebuild it. Even if you could rebuild the temple, you cannot start worship.
Yeah.
And as a result, the Essenes disappear, the Zealots are killed, the Sadducees are killed. What's left is Pharisaical Judaism. And Pharisaical Judaism has to decide how to go about being Jewish in a world with no temple and no priests. And that's when, and this could get us in trouble.
Yeah.
That's when they kind of set the ground rules for what we think of as modern Judaism.
Like rabbinic traditions.
Rabbinic Judaism. So modern Judaism is just the Pharisees' version of Judaism.
Sure.
It's all about law obedience. It's all about reading the Bible in a certain way.
It's where the Talmud came from.
Exactly.
Oral traditions. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And significant for Christians, they had a whole structure already set up to handle this, which was the synagogues. And you can tell from Paul in Acts that he still thinks of himself as a member of synagogues. Everywhere he goes, he stops at the synagogue first.
Right.
And he talks to them first. And it's not until the Council of Jamnia, which may or may not have actually happened, but in the hundreds, that the Jews actually kick the Christians out of the synagogue, like officially. Like you can tell it's happening when Hebrews is written, but like it doesn't officially happen until then. And that's the point at which you have the emergence of two separate religions, the New Testament covenant religion of Christianity and rabbinic Judaism, which is a different religion than the Old Testament religion of Judaism.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, it's a discreetly different, has the same book, worships the same God in their mind, but
the form and function of it is completely different.
Oh yeah. There's no sacrifice. There's no going to the temple at all. It's all almsgiving, prayer, kosher laws, circumcision.
Yeah.
These are...
And even today, you can see how the traditions of Judaism are kind of split into those that have kind of assimilated to this, like, oh, it's really virtue-based, it's diet-based, and then those who are like, no, we need to rebuild the temple, we need to get the sacrificial system going again, like, we need to restore what was lost 2,000 years ago.
It's like still a problem, right?
Yeah.
I believe this is Ariel Sharon, the former prime minister of Israel and hugely popular, who at one point, like, himself took the Temple Mount again, and was really hopeful that it meant, like, he literally took it with a machine gun.
Yeah.
He was really hopeful that it would mean that they would keep it and get to rebuild. But the Israeli government gave it back to the Arabs because they didn't want a world war.
Oh yeah, good move.
And so it still belongs to the Arabs.
Yeah.
And
that's a good PR move, though. Yeah, just seeing him like on the cover of Time magazine in front of the Temple Mount
with a gun. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think you rode that to several elections.
I'm sure. Yeah. So remember that one time, guys?
Yeah.
Okay, a couple questions before we dive into the inevitable theological implications of this.
All right.
One is, I'm really curious about, so the background that I did about this, I listened to a 2-part podcast from the Catholic Brothers. Shout out to that podcast. And they spoke about the fall of Jerusalem from the vantage point of the church in Jerusalem.
Oh, that's
and
cool.
It was very interesting because, we know that James, the brother of Jesus, kind of becomes like this core figure of like the Jerusalem church. He's not as prolific in like Acts or the epistles as someone like Paul or Peter, but whenever he's referenced both canonically and traditionally, there's a lot of weight applied to him as an individual. Yeah. And their thought process was, they were like very blunt. They were like, yes, we believe that the temple was destroyed as God's judgment for Jesus being killed, but we also think that James's martyrdom was also something that destabilized the kind of the diplomacy in the area that kind of allowed for that to happen. So, but I mean, I think the first thing you said was this was the point where Christianity went from being a Jewish religion to something totally distinct. So how would you kind of connect, like what impact did this have on the church in Jerusalem?
So the cool thing about with the Catholics, they're just stealing from Josephus.
Yeah.
So Josephus says that there is and it's a disputed passage in Josephus. He says that the fall of Jerusalem is punishment for the murder of James, because James was respected by everybody. He was respected by both the Jews and the Christians as a completely righteous man. And when they executed him for no reason at all, the story, did they go into the story about that?
They did. I don't remember it super well.
The Jewish authorities wanted him to, I think, say that people shouldn't talk about Jesus, and they thought that he was going to do this, so they brought him up to a high point in the temple.
Yeah, and then they pushed him off because he was like, Jesus is Lord.
Yes, exactly. And they literally pushed him off. It didn't kill him, and so they killed him.
Right.
And it was just so blatantly unjust that this was. Josephus says that's the point. That's why Jerusalem. That's the point at which they've done too much now.
Sure.
And Jerusalem falls. For the church, I mean, like, I don't know. So one of the, like, if you want to say positively how it affects us, it means that it is impossible. What Hebrews is arguing you shouldn't do, which is go back to worshiping at the temple as a primary means of knowing God, becomes an impossibility. And the foundation that was laid by the synagogues becomes our reality.
Yeah.
We also worship one day a week. We also are people that go to understand and read a book. We also have a structure of clergy who explain to us what the text meant, and our churches become social places for social gathering. And I think that's something that happens after the fall of Jerusalem in a very real way. I mean, you see in Acts, Peter and John and James are still going to the temple all the time. Paul, when he shows up in Jerusalem, we don't hear about him going to Sunday service. We hear about him going to the temple several times, though. And so this is the point at which I had somebody say to me one time that he believed that Jesus died in AD 30, and that 70 is exactly 40 years later, and that the point of that is that God gave the church and the Jews a 40-year period of sort of like neither here nor there before he drew to a very, very hard close, the temple era.
Yeah. It's kind of like the old things are passing away, and at that point, they passed away.
And they did. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and there is a distinct enough, the new Judaism that emerges, Rabbinic Judaism, is distinct enough that I think a lot of the people who converted to Christianity who were Jewish, and there was a huge number of them, Acts says that a bunch of the Pharisees convert, even some of the priests convert. They stop identifying as Jewish in a religious sense. Yeah. And that's probably a big step for the church, of no longer having an ethnic anchor. And now, because there's no ethnic anchor, the whole Galatians, free, slave, man, woman, Jew, Greek, that none of this is in Christ. Sure. Becomes even more of a reality. It's not like it's the Jews and the Gentiles in the churches anymore, because the Jews have been left behind by the Jewish Christians have been left behind by their people too. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's a big element too.
That's a compelling point, because I'm too reformed to think through what if scenarios. I'll leave that for the Lutherans. Thanks. But I think to myself, like, if the temple never falls, what happens to the history of Christianity? Yeah. And like, it's a fascinating thought experiment to walk through, but I think you could make a point that like because Paul is very clear. Like you're absolutely right. Like the book of Hebrews is literally teaching Jews how to understand everything that the temple stood for, while also detaching them from the significance of the physical temple. But so the fact that was being written about so repetitively in the New Testament shows that it was a stumbling block for a lot of Jewish Christians. And so it's like, yeah, like what if in this, universe that doesn't exist, like there, like Christianity stays like a Jewish pocket religion, and in the Gentile circles it starts to fade out because they don't feel that ethnic connection. Like
More
that.
welcome, yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting to see the implications of that.
Can you imagine? I assume everybody has experience of like talking to people who have been to Israel, and like that's all they can talk about, right?
Yeah.
Really, is that you?
Yeah, I lived there for 6 months.
You did?
I did, yeah.
Well, see, you're not in this category though, because I've never heard you talk about it in all our friendship.
Here's my thing, dude. Like I was there enough to where, like, I lived about a 20-minute bus ride outside of Jerusalem. So I could go to the old city as much as I wanted to. And I remember the first time I went to the old city, and I remember the last time I went to the old city. And the first time, you almost have this, like, culture of expectation where it's like, I'm going somewhere that is, like, touched by the holy hands of the patriarchs and the prophets and the apostles. And then the last time you show up, you're like, I hope I get shawarma today. Like I hope the guy that makes pomegranate juice is there. I really like talking to that guy. Like, so I mean, I think that but the thing was, I wasn't sad to lose that glimmer, because the more I spent time around like the touristy stuff, the more I realized, like, I still remember seeing a young lady, probably a faithful Christian to this day, but a young lady posing for a selfie around the tomb where Jesus supposedly like was resurrected. And I just thought, this feels just so like cheapened, you know? Bougie. So like, yeah, absolutely. So I love Israel, with a lot of asterisks on it.
Well, but like, I mean, can you imagine that fervor that you see? I mean, I literally had a conversation with somebody today before I came over here who was like, I've been to Israel, and I'm learning Hebrew so I can go back again, like modern Hebrew, so I can go back again sometime in the future. You imagine if the temple still stood, how that would be amplified, like just turned up to an 11.
Oh yeah.
Because then you could go see the temple, like the temple. And I think it's deeply important because of what Paul says about the Holy Spirit dwelling with us, the Holy Spirit being in the church, the Holy Spirit being in our very bodies, that like the temple had to fall, or else there would be a question of like, where is God's special presence?
Yeah. That's this is such an interesting topic, I think, particularly in America and in the West, because of what happened in the 20th century with the widespread genocide of Jews, where this has become a topic that I think Christians are not good at engaging with, over fears of whether it be anti-Semitism, or you'll hear like the term like replacement theology being thrown around and things like that. But it's not really engaging well with Scripture and with history to ignore like this reality. And then in that kind of vacuum where there's not good conversation going on, we see Christians waiting for a third temple. Like that's something that's like really common in, I think, the general kind of evangelical consciousness in America, is that like, well, of course we're going to see like a temple like reemerge in Jerusalem. And I think it betrays some misunderstandings.
There's literally a group I think it's in Wyoming, who is trying to breed a red heifer, so that when the temple does get
specifically for
so that when the temple does eventually get rebuilt, they'll have red heifers, because apparently they've gone extinct or something. I don't know.
Is this like a GMO thing? Like, are they like?
No, I honestly, like, legit, that's exactly what it is, I believe.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So I agree with this.
What a time to be alive.
It is.
Yeah. The one thing that bums me out about, and when I said that I loved Israel with a bunch of asterisks, I love the people of Israel with 0 asterisks. Like, that was probably one of my favorite times. Was all the community that I had in Israel was phenomenal, amongst Israelis and all types of other people as well. But the secret sauce that we apply to the Israeli people, or to those with Jewish blood in like some evangelical circles, is like so uncomfortable. And especially because, just like what you're talking about, it it leads to almost this superstition of like, you know, I feel like I'm talking to like the Greeks when they would say, I saw 3 birds flying overhead, and you know what that means, you know, we're gonna have a great harvest. Like, oh, it's stuff like that. It's all blood moons and red cows and third temples, and it's just like there's no linear like thought pattern to it. So much of it just seems really just convoluted.
Well, and
we lost half of our listeners when I said that, and I just want to say I'm really sorry.
Maybe we should send this to St. Louis, then you can pick up some other ones.
We're just leveling up our life right now.
It's true. We destroyed the Catholics with the Maximilian one. We're just...
You just can't pin us down.
Yeah, and they're like, that's fine, unsubscribe.
Well, and I am one of those people that I think that God is not done with his people, the Jews, specifically the ethnic Jews. I think that's what Paul says in Romans 10 and 11.
Oh, absolutely.
But yeah, also as Christians, we should not be placing our hope in the temple. I mean, that's just ridiculous. That's entirely what I mean. When you said that the book of Hebrews shows the temple rites and rituals and structures as the foreshadow of something, it goes out of its way to be offensive about how the high priest is insufficient.
Right.
Just, I mean, like to be explicit about the insufficiency of the once a year sacrifice for the atonement of the sins of the people.
Right.
And that's really hurtful to say that. So it's probably by Paul. Let's be honest.
Gosh, did you know that there was a Jeopardy question, Final Jeopardy, yesterday?
Do you know the answer? I know the answer.
It drove me crazy, bro, because I don't know what. Like, I've always
I would have been ticked if I was on Jeopardy.
Okay, so if you don't know,
you know a lot about
the question
Bible.
was, what Pauline epistle made the most references or direct quotes to the Old Testament? And I immediately thought Romans, because I'm a pastor and I'm smart. But the answer apparently was Hebrews, because I guess someone thinks that Paul wrote Hebrews, like, definitively.
This is really funny because I was told about this morning at a Bible an elderly Bible study that I teach.
Yeah.
Hopefully none of them listen. And she told me it was Romans and it wasn't Hebrews. I love that she got backwards.
Oh.
Because if the answer was Hebrews, I would have been so ticked.
I think the answer was Hebrews.
I think it was.
Yeah. I follow a lot of people on Christian Twitter, and I think the consensus was everyone believed it should have been Romans, but that the answer, according to Jeopardy, was Hebrews, which is still just like, I don't know. Who thinks that Paul wrote that?
I would love a lawsuit to progress through the courts that involves the exegesis of whether or not Paul wrote Hebrews.
Yeah.
And like this is an aspect of like the proof for how this was done unfairly.
Call on your best scholars. Yeah.
Arrange F.F. Bruce on one side. Is he still alive? F.F. Bruce on one side and
I think so.
D.A. Carson on the other.
All right. Well, here, we're running out of time. Paul, was that weirdo... did I call you Paul just now?
You did.
I think I did, yeah. Ray, cut that out for me. Josh, was Fanny the priest, was he the apocryphal figure from Daniel?
The abomination of desolation?
That's right.
I think so.
Okay.
I do think so. I think that that prophecy may be one of those telescoping prophecies like you see in Mark 13, where Jesus is talking back and forth about the destruction of the temple and the end of the world.
Right.
And so it may not be that he is the only one. It may be that because
it's like cyclical. There's kind of this repeating fulfillment.
Right. Well, because prior to Josephus saying that, most people would have said that the abomination of desolation was when Antiochus Epiphanius IV sacrificed a pig on the temple altar. So, like, I don't know.
Didn't Caligula do something similar to that too?
Didn't he bring in some idols or something? I don't remember.
I think he made a statue of himself and put it in the temple or something like that.
That's how you can win friends. Yeah. You specifically, John.
Me? Okay, yeah. I mean, I've got some connects back over there. I'll make some phone calls. Was this what Jesus was talking about in Matthew 24?
At least partially, yeah.
Okay.
At least partially.
Okay.
I think that a lot of what he says in 24 and 25 is clearly about the end of the world too.
Mm-hmm.
And the image that one of my professors gave that I thought was helpful was the way you see a mountain range, and if you're far enough away, it just looks like a single thing. But the closer you get, the more you can see of the depth of the valleys and the other peaks and stuff like that. And so I think a lot of this is, here's a good Lutheran answer. Mm-hmm. Both and.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, for thousands of Jews, this was the end of the world, right?
Well, because, and this is, you cannot understate that.
Yeah.
This is the end of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think at least my sympathy is aroused at that point because to not be able to rely on the Day of Atonement, to rely on the ability to sacrifice, to please God with a thanksgiving offering, having that all stripped away from you, I imagine would be extraordinarily heartbreaking.
Yeah. And
that's the part of the story that I think I find myself most sympathetic in. Mm-hmm. The power plays between the Sadducees and the Zealots, and the just the deep sadness of tragedy like that.
Yeah,
that's one thing. But like really to have this is why it's so good that we have faith in Jesus, because his once for all sacrificial death, nobody can ever take that away from us.
Yeah,
that's period. That is the thing that we hold to. And I honestly do feel badly. I have a friend who's a Hasidic rabbi, and he just longs for the coming of the Messiah, and he longs for it so much. And everything, all his hope is wrapped up in the Messiah.
Yeah.
And it's because he doesn't have anything like what the Jews leading up to the destruction of the temple had. Mm-hmm. And I have this deep desire, and my prayer for him is that he could discover that Jesus is that Messiah, because then all the things that he feels he is missing, that is missing from his world and from his soul, he could have them. He's a good guy. I want that for him so badly.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, it's heartbreaking for me because I think one of the most meaningful things I remember from my seminary studies was that the Jewish people were never meant to be either elevated in like kind of hyper Zionistic terms or denigrated in anti-Semitic terms. Like they're a microcosm of humanity, and the spirit of the zealot exists in every young oppressed people group, where they're like, what if I took a sword and took back what we believed in and fought for the dignity and the well-being of my people through bloodshed? Like that is a story that's been told for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And like as much as it relates to Jesus's kind of indictment of like, hey, if you live by this sword, don't be surprised when you die by it. It's still heartbreaking because these people were so closely married to the story of the Maccabees. Like they were like, we've done this before. Like we can stand against Goliath and we can overcome, and God will bless our victory and things will be good. And it was just the most incredible loss, like where they lost their land, they lost their temple. Like, yeah, you're right. All they had left was the synagogue system, and there's such a great like I don't even want to call it an evolution, but there's such a great change to the culture of Judaism, and that was the big point at which everything changed. And it's truly heartbreaking. And I think that you're right. Like, it's beautiful that this was not a forsaking of God's promises, but actually, in a greater sense, probably a deliverance of God giving us a promise. But yeah, it's still sad.
I don't know where you are for time, but like, do you know what happened to the Christians in Jerusalem during the siege?
No.
Did you find this? Yeah. So the Eusebius, who's writing like 300, says that he has access to historical records that somebody stood up in the Jerusalem church and prophesied that it was time to get out.
Yeah.
And so just before the Romans got to Jerusalem, the entirety of the Christian church, traditionally at least, left Jerusalem and went to a place called Perea, which is a little ways away, across the Jordan River. And supposedly not a single Christian died in the siege.
And depending on how you date the book of Revelation, like that, you can read that as like the Christians knew this was coming as well. Like this is where the prophecy comes from.
Yeah. That would be the most clear indication that this was truly an act of judgment and not just happenstance, too.
There's a debate, too, what the content of that prophecy was, and one of the theories is that Mark 13 is the content of that prophecy.
Interesting.
Yeah, and that, like, somebody stood up and was like, hey, remember Jesus said this, it's time to leave, guys.
Yeah.
Don't go down to your room and get your cloak. Don't turn back. You know?
One will stay and the other's going to go.
Yeah.
I think that maybe a big takeaway from this topic, like, I'm thinking, like, for a listener who maybe, like, hasn't thought about, like, Judaism in these terms, or hasn't really read much about the fall of Jerusalem before, I think the takeaway should be, like, for the Jewish people that you know and love. Like, I have cousins that are that are Jewish, and I think about, like, the worst thing that I could offer them, I think, is pouring gas on the fire of restoring a third temple and some sort of, like, Zionism. Like, that's not what they need. That won't save them from destruction. I wouldn't offer that to anyone else. Why would I encourage someone to pursue something that is not Christ? And yeah, this is why, like, categories are important, and theology is important. And yeah, it's not something that we should ignore. I think we should be well educated about this.
Sure. And I mean, like, you know, we're well versed in kind of, like, I wouldn't even call it maybe evangelism, but like a missional method of taking the longings and the hopes of the natural human heart and speaking on how those are the fingerprints of God pointing us to a greater fulfillment. And I think one thing that's really beautiful about Jewish people is they have such a rich remembrance of their heritage, and that doesn't mean that they're, you know, just biting at the bit to become Christian, because I know that, like, unfortunately, Christianity many years after this became a big opponent and cause of opposition for the Jewish people. But it's just like, yeah, I mean, if there are people that are Jewish in your life, like, this isn't a time to, you know, to make false promises built on rusty theology, but to be able to say, like, hey, like, so much of your heritage points to, like, something that even in this destruction it was pointing to, which was the words of the man who prophesied it, who was preaching a message of deliverance.
Right. The most Jewish man who ever lived.
Exactly. Exactly.
I agree. That's great. Yeah. And why give them false promises when you can give them, like, real promises?
Yeah, the best ones. Yeah, the best ones. All right. Well, we're a few minutes over, but I was almost going to be like, shoot, we might have to do a part 2. But and I'm sure a time where we have to do a 2-parter with Mr. Palmer will come, but it is not today. But this was a blast. Thanks
Thank you for having me.
Yeah,
we will.
We'll do this again in the future for sure.
Love it.
Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Church History for Chumps. My name is John.
God bless you.
All right, see you guys later.